everyone, it's Holmes from Home Storybooks, and I'm here to talk to you today about commercial and literary fiction. This has been a really interesting discussion point started by Simon from Savage Reads, and a couple of people like Britta Bowler and Wild Reads have responded. So I thought I'd throw my 2 cents in as well. This response video drifts a lot from the original points a lot of other people have made, but let's get started. So I define commercial fiction or genre fiction as fiction with a fast plot, often in a series, though it can be standalone with high stakes. Characterization can be simpler, though no less effective, and there's a lot less ruminating on a particular theme or idea, and more of a focus on something like a case to be solved, a spouse to be won over, or a heist to be sprung. Simple, Moorish, and at times formulaic, commercial fiction sells incredibly well and is a serious staple amongst most library budgets, second-hand bookshops, and supermarket shelves. Literary fiction can be a little harder to define. I think the connotation of literary alone tends to turn people off. Typically taught in high school and college classrooms in many countries, literary fiction is often discussed for its merits. The very word merit makes my blood boil. Who decides what merit is and what makes a book literary often have a particular social capital, are educated, and are considered to be experts in the chosen field, for sometimes arbitrary reasons. If we look at many book prizes from the past few years, it's really evident to see that women of color, queer writers, and other minority groups are often excluded from these circles, or, reversely, held up as the beacon for their minority, to the exclusion of all other perspectives. Literary and academic circles can be exhausting and isolating, but through literary prizes and discussions, they can support writers and introduce authors to a new audience of readers. Literary fiction tends to focus more on themes or use well-developed characters to reveal something about ourselves, our society, and how we interact with each other. Literary fiction is actually one of my favorite genres. I love books that I can really chew on, mull over, and think about over and over again. Of course, I love a good plot, excellent characters even more so, but I love the way authors can play with language or formatting in a way they might not be able to do in commercial fiction. That said, I think there are clear examples of books that are both commercial fiction and literary fiction. This might be a whole other video in and of itself, but one could almost consider classics a wonderful example of genre fiction becoming literary. Jane Austen is a perfect example, romances of their time now discussed in university classrooms everywhere. Accessible, widely read, but sometimes still ignored for their romance aspect, Austen's books are the perfect marriage between literary and commercial, in my humble opinion. I read really quite widely, and I think one of the reasons literary fiction appeals to me so much is because it isn't limited by genre. I love gothic southern fiction, I love historical fiction, I love cult classic books, I love short stories. Genuinely, give me anything and I will probably read it. For me, and this might sound bizarre, but so much of my initial attitude towards commercial fiction, or genre fiction, or literary fiction can be looked at through a feminist lens. That sounds really scholarly and archaic, but it's super simple. When I was young, I didn't used to read genre fiction much at all. In fact, I read almost exclusively classics and literary fiction. I didn't like young adult at all, and it didn't help that as a genre, in my time, it really focused on vampires and love triangles. I found, on the whole, rather than allowing me to escape, YA was merely a bookish version of surface-level gossip I was inundated with at school. Now I think the genre has improved a lot, and I've also gotten better at identifying my reading tastes. But when I was 17, a whole other story altogether. I used to consider myself not like other readers, and while I never looked down upon actual readers of genre fiction, looking at the whole collection of it on the shelves used to bore me. I mean, who wants to read about a detective solving 79 different cases in 79 different books? Interesting logic I had, considering one of my favorite books of all time was the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan-Doyle, arguably one of the best commercial pieces of fiction of all time. I think a love of commercial fiction comes from the fascination of the genre. As my mom so eloquently said, in regards to the crime genre, there is a fascination both in the behavior and the motivation of the criminal, so the psychological aspects, and the police procedural or investigative aspects of the case. In well-written crime books, the major characters are well-developed and sometimes written in multiple perspectives, which heightens the tension and suspense. Kingsley Amis, who himself was a writer, famously refused to read the work of his son Martin Amis, who wrote literary fiction. Amis Sr. apparently refused to read anything unless it began with "a shot rang out in the darkness," so Kingsley allegedly never read any books written by his son, particularly as he got older. Although, interestingly, there was one subgenre of commercial fiction I gravitated towards, and it was romance fiction. A friend of mine dared me to read Captain Jack's Woman by Stephanie Lawrence, which I found at once nauseatingly sweet and also delicious in its readability. I read like half of it in a day. There was a pirate and a woman dressed as a man, and then the hero was like, "I'm into that person. Does that make me gay?" I'm like, what more did I want in a novel? Romance continued to be my bookish equivalent of cotton candy, carrying me through any major exam times. I don't always read romance books, or bodice terrors as they're fondly known in my house, but when I do, I really binge read them. However, the majority of books I read were considered to be cult classics or literary fiction. I read what I thought I was supposed to read. I read a lot of modern classics by William S. Burroughs, mostly because he was queer and I was starved for queer representation, and Jack Kerouac, whose writing I liked less and less the more I read. I read Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger and I loathed it, and I couldn't finish The Stranger by Albert Camus because it was just so depressing. I read and love F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby and a selection of his short stories. His writing is spectacular because he manages to carefully pick apart the American dream without criticizing those who follow it. I did read Martin Amis. I read Dead Babies, which is a story about a group of young people who rent a house and get up to all sorts of drug and sex-filled antics. At the time, I loved it because I was 17 and it totally wasn't marketed towards a young woman like me. And although Amis's writing was fun, a sort of P.G. Wodehouse meets Marquis de Sade, to echo the blurb, the women in his books were poorly written, poorly constructed echoes of ideas of women. This continues to be a theme in a lot of the literary fiction I read, modern or otherwise. Looking at you, George Orwell, God, why did I read 1984? Why? Why? Lots of these authors were cis white men, sometimes gay, but a consistent theme in their work was that they really didn't like women or found them inconsequential. This affected me more than I think I realized, and the only person who gave me excellent reading suggestions was my mum. She told me to read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, The Secret History by Donna Tartt, all brilliant books I've loved. But it did take me years to get around to reading them, so in the meantime I continued to read a particular brand of literary fiction. So much of that was me desperately trying to prove myself. I felt that if I read books that were considered literary, then I would be taken seriously. I think all young girls hunger to be taken seriously, and I didn't want anything, particularly genre fiction, to jeopardize that. And this comes into the crux of my argument in that I treated reading in the same way I did feminism. I assured myself I wasn't like other girls. This was compounded by the fact that I was, and still am, bisexual, and so my attraction to other women allowed me to be more like the boys I hung out with. Somehow. I don't want to go so far as to say I wasn't a feminist, but I do want to say that I wasn't ready to defend my feminism. I had feminist thoughts and feelings, but I rarely called anyone out in public. I didn't want to offend anyone because I didn't want to be labeled a lesbian feminazi, which was compounded, once again, by the fact that I was actually queer and generally preferred women, and sometimes entertained the radical notion of shaving my head. In my efforts to be liked and approved of, I avoided a lot of things I might actually have enjoyed. One of those things is commercial fiction. I'm a really wide reader. I probably would have loved a lot of commercial fiction if I'd read it. And in a lot of ways, the commercial fiction I did read, Joan Harris's Chocolat, I read almost all of her books actually, was the perfect marriage between providing a more in-depth reading experience than young adult without having the verbal and thematic gymnastics of literary fiction. I also read and loved Joanna Fluke's Hannah Swenson series, which is a cozy crime series. Some fantastic in titles include, but aren't limited to, blueberry muffin murder, fudge cupcake murder, strawberry shortcake murder, and so on. Remember what I said about not liking commercial crime books? Patently untrue, as it turns out. I just had to find one that I liked amongst the thousands available. In particular, I think that I avoided contemporary women's fiction or chick lit. I had so many biases against it then, and I wager I still subconsciously carry some of those biases now. To me, chick lit is fluffy, light, and on the verge of inconsequential. I felt that if I read those books, they would take away time from books that would be more meaningful to me, both in my reputation and in better match with my own reading tastes. But also, oddly, because I was afraid of it. If I read chick lit, it meant that I would be lumped in amongst all those stereotypes chick lit wrongfully carries with it. I didn't want to be seen as superficial or worthless pulp, or that I didn't have anything important to say. Of course, these stereotypes about chick lit are all incorrect, but I would wager that the stereotypes I carried in high school were the same my peers carried as well. Thus, I often enjoyed reading books I didn't like because I thought I would like them eventually, and I found it easier than risking criticisms from other people, something I retroactively discovered took a lot of effort. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, and the more I read and refine my reading tastes, the more books appeal to me through different genres. I'd really love to read erotic stories for Punjabi women by Bali Kwa Kasal, which is about a lawyer who quits her job and opens a creative writing class in the Punjabi neighborhood of London. It's published by William Morrow and came out in 2017, and lots of people loved it, although other people didn't like it so much because it felt too much like chick lit, so we'll have to see what I think. I will say that my feminism and reading tastes really did grow together, almost side by side. So much of my feminism has been crafted, shaped, altered by books, so it feels right to talk about them together. The more I read for myself and the less I read for other people, the more authors I begin to discover whom I love. I found Jhumpa Lahiri, who I picked up because The Interpreter of Maladies was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. I adored The Color Purple by Alice Walker, which needs no introduction. I also loved Maya Angelou's works, and I discovered one of my favorite literary fiction authors of all time, Zhao Go. The most important thing I have learnt in thinking about how I compare literary and commercial fiction is that I shouldn't. They should both go together and complement each other beautifully. There is a distinct difference between judgment, taste, and inherent bias. I've held those biases against commercial fiction for too long, particularly when it comes to women's fiction. And really, reading is a hobby, something most of us do for enjoyment. And if I were to give any advice to my 15-year-old self, it would be to avoid reading 1984 by George Orwell and otherwise read whatever I pleased. That's it, that's all for this video. Thank you for coming along with me on this remarkably personal journey. But would it be a discussion video or a review if I didn't incessantly talk about myself and what book means to me? I don't think so. Let's talk in the comments below. Bye everyone!